The howling came first, a mournful chorus that rose from the darkness beyond the tree line. In the flickering light of his campfire, Elijah Thorne froze, his weathered hand suspended above the rabbit he was skinning. The blood on his fingers caught the firelight, appearing black in the gathering dusk of the Colorado highlands. It was the winter of 1873, and the Sawatch Range had received snow earlier than anyone could recall. The wolves had come down from the higher country sooner, too. Elijah counted 7 distinct voices in that terrible harmony. Too many. Far too many for comfort. His eyes darted to the crude contraptions surrounding his camp, strange assemblies of metal, wood, and glass that had taken him the better part of autumn to construct, curious devices that had earned him nothing but mockery from the few trappers and prospectors who occasionally passed through this remote valley. The nearest settlement was 30 miles east, the mining town of Granite, where men seeking silver and gold had carved a precarious existence into the mountainside. There, Elijah was known as Contraption Thorne, a name uttered with either amusement or contempt, depending on who spoke it. The howling grew closer. Elijah set down his skinning knife and rose slowly to his feet, his joints creaking like old leather. At 53 years of age, he had spent more than half his life in these mountains. He had outlived most men who chose this solitary existence, but not through luck. Elijah Thorne survived because he observed, he thought, and he adapted. "Come then," he whispered into the darkness. "Let us see if old Contraption Thorne is as foolish as they say." The first of his strange devices was already beginning to whir and click, sensing the changing air pressure as the pack drew closer. The locals had laughed when he traded 3 fine beaver pelts for a broken barometer and a cracked magnifying glass in Granite last spring. They would not be laughing tonight. A pair of yellow eyes flashed at the edge of the firelight, then another and another. The wolves had arrived to test the strange barrier Elijah had created. The mountain man stood perfectly still, alone against a gathering pack, waiting to discover if his understanding of nature, machines, and predators would keep him alive until dawn. The winter wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and hungry wolves. And somewhere in that wind was the subtle melody of thin metal pieces turning against one another, glass reflecting firelight in unexpected patterns, and the low rumble of hollow logs that would soon unleash the strange music that Elijah Thorne believed would save his life. The wolves were about to discover what the people of Granite could not understand. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are not made of gunpowder and lead, but of curiosity, observation, and a mind willing to see the world differently. The alpha wolf took one step forward, and the first of the strange contraptions began to sing. In the autumn of 1873, deep in the Sawatch Range of the Colorado Territory, Elijah Thorne had established his winter camp earlier than usual. The aspen had barely begun their golden transformation when he selected a small clearing bordered by dense pine forest on 3 sides and a rocky overhang to the north. The location was not chosen for its beauty, though the view of Mount Princeton rising in the distance was certainly magnificent. Elijah had selected this spot for more practical reasons, ones that spoke to his unusual understanding of the wilderness. The clearing offered clear sightlines in all directions. The rocky overhang provided natural shelter from the northern winds that would soon bring winter's fury down from the higher elevations. Most importantly, it was situated near a small creek that Elijah knew would not freeze completely, even in the deepest cold of January. Water was life in the mountains, especially during winter. What set Elijah's camp apart from those of other mountain men was not its location, but the strange collection of devices that surrounded it. Where most trappers would establish a simple perimeter of snares to warn of approaching predators, Elijah had constructed what appeared to be a madman's gallery of useless contraptions. Glass bottles of various sizes hung from tree branches, positioned to catch both wind and sunlight. Metal strips salvaged from broken tools and abandoned mining equipment were arranged in patterns that made no sense to the casual observer. Hollow logs, carefully selected and modified, were positioned at specific intervals around the camp. The few visitors who had passed through during the early autumn had not bothered to hide their disdain. "What in tarnation are you building out here, Thorne?" Jacob Winters had asked when he and 2 other trappers stopped to trade news and coffee in early October. "Looks like you finally lost what little sense you had left." Winters was a successful trapper, known throughout the region for his skill with a rifle and his knowledge of beaver habits. He had trapped these mountains for 20 years and had the scars to prove it. including a ragged line across his throat where a wounded grizzly had nearly separated his head from his shoulders 7 years prior. "Just preparing for winter," Elijah had replied calmly, continuing to position a curved piece of sheet metal against a pine trunk. "Preparing for the lunatic asylum, more like," muttered Samuel Reed, the youngest of the 3 visitors. At perhaps 30 years of age, Reed had the confidence of a man who had not yet faced true hardship in the wilderness. "Everyone knows the only sure protection against wolves is a good rifle and a hot fire." Elijah had merely nodded, unwilling to waste breath explaining his methods to men who had already made up their minds. He had endured their mockery for years, ever since he first began experimenting with alternative methods of survival in the harsh mountain environment. "The wolves are coming down early this year," warned Martin Cooper, the 3rd trapper. Unlike the others, Cooper spoke without derision, only concern. "We found fresh tracks up by Mineral Basin last week. Big pack, maybe a dozen or more. You might want to consider moving your camp closer to Granite for the winter." "I appreciate the warning," Elijah had said, "but I believe I will be safer here." The 3 men had exchanged knowing glances, the kind reserved for those believed too stubborn or foolish to recognize their own peril. They departed with shaking heads and mutterings about poor old contraption Thorn, not likely seeing the spring thaw. What they failed to understand was that Elijah's contraptions were not the product of a mind unhinged by solitude, but rather the careful application of knowledge gathered across a lifetime of observation and study. Before coming to the mountains 30 years earlier, Elijah had apprenticed to a clockmaker in Boston. There, he had developed an intimate understanding of mechanisms, of cause and effect, of how simple movements could combine to create complex results. In the wilderness, he had applied this mechanical knowledge to the natural world. He observed how sound traveled differently through the mountain air depending on temperature and humidity. He noted how certain animals responded to specific stimuli, not just those that threatened, but those that confused or disoriented. He studied the behaviors of wolves not merely as a hunter studies prey, but as a scientist might examine a natural phenomenon with curiosity and respect. The contraptions surrounding his camp were the result of these observations, combined with fragments of knowledge gathered from diverse sources across his unusual life. From a Ute medicine man who had once shared Elijah's fire during a blizzard, he learned how certain arrangements of objects could create sounds that disturbed predators. From an eccentric German geologist he had guided through the mountains years ago, he gained understanding of how light could be manipulated using glass and reflective surfaces. Most importantly, from his own patient observation of wolf behavior over decades, he had developed theories about their sensory perceptions that few white men in the territory had bothered to consider. Wolves did not experience the world as humans did. Their senses of smell and hearing operated on levels that most men could barely comprehend. Elijah believed this difference could be exploited, not through violence, but through cleverly designed devices that created sensory barriers as effective as any wall of stone. As the first heavy snows began to fall in late October, Elijah completed the final adjustments to his protective system. The devices appeared random to untrained eyes, but each had been positioned with mathematical precision. Some would respond to changes in wind direction, others to temperature fluctuations. Some would activate only at night, when firelight or moonlight struck glass surfaces at specific angles. Together, they formed an invisible barrier designed to overwhelm and confuse the acute senses of approaching predators. By early November, Elijah's preparations were complete. His cabin, a modest structure built against the rocky overhang, was stocked with enough dried meat, beans, and flour to last until spring. Firewood was stacked in neat rows along the northern wall, protected from snow by an extended eave. He had set his trap lines in the surrounding valleys, focusing on marten and fox rather than beaver, as their pelts would fetch better prices come spring. Now all that remained was to wait and see if his inventions would perform as he had calculated. The first test came sooner than expected, on a night when the moon hung full and bright above the snow-covered landscape, illuminating the world in shades of silver and shadow. Elijah had just finished skinning a rabbit for his evening meal when he heard them. Wolves. The sound began as a distant howl, then another joined and another. He counted the voices carefully. 7 distinct timbres, a large pack, hungry in the early winter, seeking prey in the lower elevations. Most mountain men would have immediately reached for a rifle. Elijah instead moved calmly about his camp, making small adjustments to several of his devices, ensuring they were properly positioned to respond to the approaching predators. Only when these preparations were complete did he take up his rifle, though he did not immediately load it. The weapon was a last resort, not his primary defense. The wolves drew closer, their howls now interspersed with the silence that indicated they were on the hunt. Elijah stood by his fire, waiting. The first pair of eyes appeared at the edge of the clearing, glowing yellow in the reflected firelight. Then more appeared, spread out among the trees, calculating, assessing. The alpha, a massive male with fur the color of smoke, took a cautious step into the clearing. The moment its paw pressed into the snow beyond the tree line, the first of Elijah's contraptions activated. A sudden gust of wind passing through the clearing caused a series of glass bottles to emit a low, pulsing hum. The sound was barely perceptible to Elijah's human ears, but the effect on the wolves was immediate. The alpha froze, ears flattened against its skull, yellow eyes widening. The sound grew louder as the wind maintained its course through the clearing, passing through carefully positioned funnels of hollow wood and causing metal strips to vibrate at specific frequencies. To human ears, the result was a strange, almost musical discord. To the wolves, with their sensitive hearing attuned to frequencies beyond human perception, the effect was apparently disorienting. The alpha took a step backward, shaking its head as if trying to clear it. The other wolves remained at the edge of the clearing, suddenly hesitant. Elijah remained motionless, observing with the calm detachment of a man conducting an experiment. When the wind shifted slightly, another set of devices activated. Glass lenses positioned to catch the firelight suddenly projected rapidly moving patterns of light across the snow, creating an illusion of shifting ground between the wolves and the camp. This visual confusion, combined with the disorienting sounds, caused several of the younger wolves to retreat further into the trees. The alpha, however, was not so easily deterred. After its initial surprise, the massive wolf began to advance once more, testing this strange barrier, driven by hunger and the instinct to lead its pack. As it crossed an invisible line Elijah had mentally marked in the snow, the mountain man reached down and lifted a small lever partially buried near his feet. This action triggered his most complex device, one that had taken the better part of a month to perfect. Beneath the snow, a series of connected wooden channels suddenly released small streams of water Elijah had diverted from the nearby creek. The water flowed into depressions containing mixtures of minerals and organic compounds he had carefully prepared, substances gathered from hot springs and plants known to produce strong odors when combined with water. The resulting scent was not powerful to human senses, but to the wolves. It created an invisible wall of smell that signaled danger more effectively than any physical barrier. It mimicked the territorial markings of bears, mountain lions, and other apex predators, combined with subtle chemical signals that triggered instinctive caution. The alpha stopped abruptly, nostrils flaring, confusion evident in its posture. It growled low in its throat, torn between hunger and the overwhelming sensory warnings that something dangerous and incomprehensible lay between it and potential prey. For several long minutes, the standoff continued. Elijah remained by his fire. The wolves lingered at the edges of his invisible barrier, and the wind carried the strange music of his contraptions through the clearing. Finally, the alpha turned away, retreating into the darkness of the forest. One by one, the other wolves followed, their yellow eyes disappearing like candles being extinguished. Only when the last wolf had vanished did Elijah release the breath he had been holding. His system had worked, at least for now. But he knew the wolves would return, driven by winter hunger and the need to feed the pack. This had been merely the first test of his unusual methods, and the long winter had only just begun. The following morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Frost rimmed Elijah's beard as he emerged from his cabin to inspect his defensive perimeter. Fresh wolf tracks circled the entire clearing, indicating that after retreating from the direct approach, the pack had tested the boundaries of his camp from all sides. Yet nowhere had they crossed the invisible line his contraptions protected. As he carefully reset the triggered devices and replenished the scent mixtures, Elijah considered the wolves' behavior with scientific detachment. They had shown intelligence and caution, exactly as he had predicted. Unlike many predators that relied primarily on physical strength, wolves survived through adaptation and learning. They would not simply abandon a potential food source after one failed attempt. "They will try again," he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the silence of the snow-covered clearing, "and they will try differently." He spent the day reinforcing his systems, anticipating how the wolves might adapt their approach. Additional scent markers were placed at wider intervals. Glass bottles were repositioned to catch different wind patterns. By late afternoon, as the early winter darkness began to fall, he was confident his camp remained secure. That night, the wolves returned as expected, but their approach was indeed different. Rather than entering the clearing as a loosely organized group, they came in a tight formation, moving as a coordinated unit behind the alpha. Elijah watched with genuine admiration for their adaptive strategy. By staying close together, they created a smaller target, minimizing their exposure to the disorienting sensory effects of his contraptions. Once again, the sound devices activated first, creating their strange symphony of discordant tones. The wolves hesitated but continued their advance, pushing through the auditory barrier with evident discomfort, but determined purpose. When they reached the point where the scent markers had repelled them the previous night, they paused longer, the alpha testing the air with heightened caution. Elijah had anticipated this more determined approach. Quietly, he activated a new device, one he had prepared specifically for this scenario. From beneath a snow-covered mound near the center of his perimeter, a mechanism began to turn, powered by the weight of melting snow. The device was essentially a modified weather vane, but instead of measuring wind direction, it created it. The spinning motion forced air through a series of narrow tubes, producing a pulsing current that carried particles of dried wolf's bane and other plants known to irritate canine senses. Unlike the previous night's scent barrier, which relied on territorial marking, this defense targeted physical discomfort, creating an invisible cloud of irritants that would affect the wolves' sensitive noses and eyes. The effect was subtle at first, then increasingly evident as the wolves began to blink rapidly and shake their heads. Several of the younger pack members sneezed repeatedly, backing away in obvious distress. The alpha held its position longer, yellow eyes fixed on Elijah with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its calculation. Man and wolf regarded each other across the barrier of invention and instinct, each recognizing in the other a worthy opponent. Finally, the alpha turned away, leading its pack back into the forest with a dignity that Elijah could not help but respect. "They will return," he said softly to himself, "and they will be hungrier still." For the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. The wolves would approach each night, testing his defenses from different directions, using varying strategies. Each time, Elijah's contraptions repelled them, but each encounter required him to develop new refinements, new combinations of sensory deterrents. It became an unspoken dialogue between man and wolves, a contest of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Elijah came to recognize individual members of the pack, assigning them names based on their behaviors. The alpha he called Shadow, for its smoke-colored fur and ability to appear suddenly at the edge of firelight. A smaller female with unusual amber eyes became Russet. 2 younger males, clearly siblings by their identical markings, he named Twin and Brother. By mid-December, heavy snows had isolated the valley completely. No trappers or travelers passed through to break the solitude. Elijah maintained his vigilance, checking his defensive perimeter each morning and evening, replenishing and adjusting his contraptions as needed. The wolves continued their nightly testing of his barriers, though their approaches grew less frequent, as deep snow made hunting difficult throughout the region. Then came the storm that would change everything. It began innocently enough, with high clouds gathering over the mountains to the west. By mid-afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl that drowned out all other sounds. Snow fell so thickly that Elijah could barely see 10 feet beyond his cabin door. For 3 days, the blizzard raged without pause. Elijah remained inside his shelter, venturing out only to feed his fire and check that his roof was not collecting too much weight of snow. On the 4th morning, he awoke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Drifts rose higher than a man's head in some places, while in others, the fierce wind had scoured the ground nearly bare. Elijah's first concern was his defensive perimeter. Many of his contraptions were now buried beneath feet of snow, their carefully calibrated mechanisms frozen or displaced. The paths he had created for his scent mixtures were completely obliterated. In essence, the storm had neutralized most of his protection against the wolves. He worked frantically throughout the short winter day, digging out what devices he could find, repositioning others to account for the altered landscape. But as darkness fell, he knew his system was compromised. Too many components were damaged or misaligned. The intricate network of triggers and responses he had created was now fragmented, unreliable. That night, the wolves came again. Elijah counted their voices as they called to one another through the darkness. Only 5 distinct howls answered the alpha's call. The storm had taken its toll on the pack as well, perhaps separating them or claiming the weakest members. As moonlight broke through scattered clouds, Elijah saw them emerge from the trees. They were noticeably thinner than before, their ribs visible beneath their thick winter coats. Hunger had made them desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. The alpha, Shadow, led them directly toward the cabin, no longer testing the boundaries but charging straight for the perceived weakness in Elijah's defenses. Most of his primary contraptions failed to activate, buried or damaged by the storm. A few glass bottles produced their dissonant hum, but the effect was fragmented, inconsistent. The scent barriers had been washed away by melting snow. For the first time since the wolves had begun testing his camp, Elijah raised his rifle, prepared to use it if necessary. Yet even in this moment of crisis, his mind worked on the problem, seeking alternatives to violence. As the wolves crossed the now compromised perimeter, moving with the fluid grace of predators sensing victory, Elijah reached behind him and grasped a small metal lever attached to what appeared to be a simple box mounted on his cabin wall. This was his final defense, one he had built but never deployed, hoping it would not be necessary. The device was the most complex of all his contraptions, combining principles of sound reflection, light manipulation, and something the German geologist had called resonant frequency. With a quick prayer that his calculations were correct, Elijah pulled the lever. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from 6 different locations around the clearing, previously concealed mechanisms activated simultaneously. Metal plates began to vibrate at precise frequencies, creating sound waves that humans could barely perceive, but that would affect canine ears profoundly. Mirrors positioned to catch moonlight suddenly rotated, projecting rapidly moving patterns of light across the snow. Most importantly, the hollow logs he had positioned months earlier now revealed their purpose, as air forced through them by small bellows created deep, thrumming tones that mimicked the subsonic rumble of an approaching avalanche. To Elijah's human senses, the effect was subtle. A strange vibration felt more than heard, an unsettling play of light and shadow across the snow. To the wolves, with their heightened sensitivity to both sound and danger, the impact was dramatic. The pack stopped as one, frozen in their tracks. The sensation of imminent disaster, of earth and snow about to come crashing down, triggered their deepest survival instincts. Shadow, the alpha, was the first to react, turning sharply away from Elijah's cabin and bounding back toward the forest. The others followed immediately, their retreat not the calculated withdrawal of previous encounters, but a headlong flight from perceived catastrophe. Within moments they had vanished into the darkness beyond the trees. Elijah stood motionless for several minutes, rifle still ready, waiting to see if the wolves would return. When the forest remained silent, he finally lowered his weapon and released a long, shuddering breath. His final contraption had worked, transforming the wolves' superior senses from advantage to vulnerability. As he turned to re-enter his cabin, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A single wolf remained, partially concealed behind a snow-covered pine. It was Russet, the amber-eyed female. She had not fled with the others, but stayed behind, watching him with what seemed like calculation rather than fear. Elijah raised his rifle again, then slowly lowered it. Something in the wolf's demeanor spoke of intelligence rather than threat. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the moonlit snow, predator and prey, yet something more complex as well. Then Russet turned and melted into the forest following her pack. The wolf's behavior troubled Elijah as he settled back inside his cabin. Unlike the others, Russet had not been fooled by his contraption, or at least not completely. She had recognized the deception for what it was, a clever imitation of danger rather than danger itself. It was a level of discernment he had not anticipated, and it suggested that his final defense might not remain effective for long. The following day, Elijah went to check his trap lines. finding most of them buried or displaced by the storm. He reset what he could, though game had become scarce in the deep snow. As he worked, he remained alert for signs of the wolf pack, but the forest was quiet, the wolves having retreated to some distant hollow to recover from their fright. That night, for the first time in weeks, no howling disturbed the silence around his camp. Nor did the wolves appear the following night, or the one after that. A week passed with no sign of the pack. Elijah maintained his vigilance, repairing his contraptions as best he could, but as January gave way to February, he began to hope that perhaps the wolves had moved on to hunting grounds where prey was more accessible and less protected by strange devices. This hope proved premature. On a night when clouds obscured both moon and stars, plunging the forest into profound darkness, Elijah was awakened by a sound he had not heard before. Not the howling of wolves in the distance, but a low, persistent scratching at the base of his cabin wall. Moving silently in the darkness, he took up his rifle and positioned himself beside the small window that faced the direction of the sound. For several minutes he waited, listening as the scratching continued, methodical and purposeful. Finally, he struck a match and lit the small oil lamp that stood ready on his table. The sudden light, shining through the window, illuminated a scene that caused Elijah's blood to run cold. There, pressing against the lower logs of his cabin, was Shadow, the alpha wolf. But the animal was not alone in its efforts. Working alongside it, clawing at the same section of wall, was Russet. And beside her, contributing to the systematic attempt to breach his shelter, were twin and brother. The wolves were not merely testing his defenses now, they were actively working together to find a weakness in the physical structure of his cabin. The storm had buried many of his exterior contraptions, and those that remained functional were designed to keep wolves away from the perimeter, not to repel them once they had already infiltrated it. What struck Elijah most forcefully was the coordination of their efforts. This was not random scratching, but a concentrated attack on a specific section of wall, one where melting snow had caused slight warping of the logs. Somehow, they had identified the most vulnerable point in his shelter, and were focusing their efforts there with a strategy that seemed almost human in its calculation. The light from his lamp caused the wolves to pause briefly, yellow and amber eyes reflecting the flame as they looked toward the window. But rather than fleeing from the sudden illumination, they simply resumed their work with renewed determination, as if understanding that their opportunity was limited. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. The wolves had learned from each encounter, adapting their approach based on previous failures. They had observed his contraptions and found ways around them. Most disturbingly, they had recognized that the devices themselves were not dangerous, merely disorienting or frightening. Once that fear was overcome, his entire system of defense became vulnerable. He considered shooting through the window, but the angle was poor, and he could not guarantee a killing shot on any of the wolves. More importantly, he recognized that killing one or even two would not solve his problem. The remaining wolves would retreat temporarily, but would return with new tactics, having learned yet another lesson about the nature of the threat he posed. What he needed was not a weapon, but an innovation, a new approach that would establish his dominance without requiring violence. As the scratching continued, and the first splinters of wood began to pull away from his cabin wall, Elijah's mind raced through possibilities, drawing on everything he had learned about wolves over decades in the wilderness. Wolves respected strength, but they also responded to hierarchy. In a pack, dominance was established through displays of power, not necessarily through deadly combat. If he could position himself as a superior predator, one too dangerous to challenge directly, perhaps he could end this siege without bloodshed. With sudden decision, Elijah moved away from the window and began gathering materials from around his small cabin. A metal cooking pot, strips of leather from his trapping supplies, small pieces of scrap metal he had collected for various contraptions, and most importantly, a small vial of oil he had rendered from skunk glands the previous autumn, an odorous substance he had planned to use as bait when spring arrived. Working quickly by lamplight, he assembled a new device unlike any of his previous contraptions. This one was not designed to confuse or frighten, but to establish dominance in terms the wolves would instinctively understand. When his preparation was complete, he pulled on his heavy coat, took up his rifle as a precaution, and moved to the cabin door. The wolves were still working at the wall, so focused on their task that they did not immediately notice as Elijah slipped outside, positioning himself with his back to the cabin's front wall. Only when he deliberately scraped his boot against the wooden step did they cease their scratching and turn toward the sound. 4 pairs of eyes reflected the dim light spilling from the cabin doorway. Elijah stood perfectly still as the wolves assessed this new development. Shadow, the alpha, took a step toward him, head low, teeth bared in a silent snarl. This was the moment of greatest danger, when the wolf would decide whether to attack or retreat. Elijah raised the device he had created, a contraption that looked like nothing so much as a bizarre musical instrument. With a swift motion of his hand, he activated its mechanism. The result was immediate and dramatic. A spray of skunk oil atomized in the cold air, carried toward the wolves by the sudden whoosh of air from a small bellows. Simultaneously, the metal pieces struck against one another, creating a harsh, clanging sound that echoed through the clearing. Most importantly, the arrangement of leather strips suddenly ignited, having been soaked in lamp oil, creating a brief but intense flash of flame that illuminated the entire scene in harsh, leaping shadows. The combination of noxious scent, startling noise, and sudden fire created an overwhelming sensory assault. The wolves recoiled as one, even Shadow backing away with involuntary submission. But Elijah was not finished. Taking a calculated risk, he stepped forward, toward the retreating wolves, his device still emitting its combination of smell, sound, and light. This was the language of dominance the wolves understood, not the passive defense of his previous contraptions, but an aggressive assertion of superior power. He took another step forward, and another. The wolves continued to retreat, maintaining the distance between themselves and this suddenly threatening human. When he had driven them to the edge of the clearing, Elijah stopped. Shadow had retreated with the others, but now held his ground, torn between instinctive caution and the need to maintain authority over his pack. The alpha's yellow eyes locked with Elijah's, each taking the measure of the other in this crucial moment. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah lowered his device, but maintained his posture of confidence. He was communicating in wolf language now, establishing boundaries rather than merely defending them. After a long, tense moment, Shadow lowered his gaze slightly and turned away, not in panic, but in acknowledgement. The alpha was conceding this territory, accepting Elijah's dominance claim. One by one, the wolves melted back into the forest darkness, following their leader. Last to leave was Russet, the amber-eyed female who had shown such unusual perception. Before disappearing into the trees, she paused, regarding Elijah with what seemed almost like respect, one predator recognizing the skill of another. Then she too was gone, and Elijah was alone in the moonlit clearing, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He waited several minutes to ensure the wolves had truly departed, before returning to his cabin to repair the damage to his wall. As he worked by lamplight, fitting new pieces of wood into the section the wolves had begun to breach, Elijah reflected on what had transpired. His original contraptions, for all their ingenuity, had addressed only part of the problem. They had created barriers based on sensory confusion, but they had not established the psychological dominance necessary to truly secure his position. The wolves had adapted to his passive defenses, learning that the strange sounds and smells posed no actual threat. Only when he demonstrated active power, engaging with them on terms they instinctively understood, did he finally succeed in claiming his territory definitively. It was a lesson he would remember in the seasons to come, a new understanding to incorporate into his ongoing study of survival in this harsh but magnificent wilderness. The remainder of the winter passed without further wolf encounters. Occasionally, Elijah would hear distant howling, but the pack did not approach his camp again. By March, when the first signs of thaw began to soften the snow cover, he had repaired and improved all of his defensive contraptions, incorporating the lessons learned from the wolves' siege. As spring fully arrived and the mountain passes cleared, trappers and prospectors once again began to appear in the valley. Jacob Winters was among the first, stopping by Elijah's camp in early May as he made his way toward the high-country beaver ponds. "Well, I'll be damned," Winters said, dismounting from his mule and casting an appraising eye over Elijah's cabin and the surrounding contraptions. Contraption Thorn made it through the winter after all. "That he did," Elijah replied with a slight smile, offering coffee to his visitor. As they sat by the outdoor fire, Winters recounted the hardships of the winter in Granite. 3 men had died when an unexpected avalanche struck a small mining operation in January. Game had been scarce, and supplies from Denver had been delayed by the heavy snows. Most surprising thing was them wolves, Winters said, accepting a refill of coffee. Biggest pack anyone's seen in these parts in years. They hit 2 camps over by Twin Lakes, killed a man and his son who were winter prospecting. Then they came right into Granite one night in February, bold as you please, took down 3 dogs and nearly got a child who was out after dark. Elijah listened with interest but without surprise. When was this exactly? Mid-February, I reckon. 15th or 16th, thereabouts. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. That would have been just after his final confrontation with Shadow and the pack, when he had established his dominance and sent them searching for easier prey. Strange thing is, Winters continued, they disappeared completely after that. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of them for months now. Figure they moved on to different hunting grounds. Perhaps, Elijah said non-committally. Winters eyed the contraptions surrounding the camp with new curiosity. These things of yours, he said slowly. What exactly do they do, Thorne? Elijah considered how to answer. He could explain the science behind his inventions, the careful study of wolf behavior that had informed their design, the principles of sensory manipulation that made them effective. But he doubted Winters or any of the other mountain men would truly understand or believe him. They keep wolves away, he said simply. Winters laughed, but there was less mockery in it than before. Well, something sure did. You're the only man I know who camped alone in this valley all winter and lived to tell about it. After Winters departed, other visitors began to appear more frequently as the summer season brought increased activity to the mountains. Word of Elijah's survival spread among the frontier community, growing with each telling until his contraptions had taken on almost magical properties in local lore. By midsummer, trappers were stopping by specifically to examine his devices, asking questions about how they might construct similar protections for their own remote camps. Elijah explained what he could, teaching them about wolf behavior and the principles behind his inventions, though few had the mechanical aptitude or patience to replicate his more complex contraptions. What surprised him most was the arrival of a government surveyor in late July, a serious young man named William Palmer, who had been sent to map the upper reaches of the Arkansas River and assess natural resources in the region. I've heard about your methods for deterring predators, Mr. Thorne, Palmer said after introducing himself. The Bureau is very interested in non-lethal approaches to wildlife management as settlement pushes further into these territories. Elijah showed the surveyor his contraptions, explaining the thinking behind each one and how they work together as a system rather than as individual deterrents. Palmer took detailed notes and sketches, asking intelligent questions that revealed a scientific mind open to unconventional ideas. This is remarkable work, Mr. Thorne, Palmer said as their discussion concluded. Would you be willing to accompany me to Denver when my survey is complete? There are people at the territorial office who would be very interested in consulting with you. Elijah declined politely. The wilderness was his home, the place where his innovations made sense. In cities, among politicians and bureaucrats, he would be as out of place as a wolf in a drawing room. Palmer seemed to understand. Then, perhaps you would allow me to document your methods in my official report, with full credit to you as the inventor, of course. To this, Elijah agreed, not from desire for recognition, but from hope that his approach might influence how people interacted with the wilderness and its inhabitants as civilization continued its relentless expansion westward. As summer gave way to autumn, Elijah began preparations for another winter in the mountains. His defensive systems were now more sophisticated than ever, incorporating all he had learned from his encounters with Shadow's pack. Yet he found himself checking the surrounding forest with particular attention as the days grew shorter, listening for familiar howls in the night. The wolves never returned to his valley. Whether they had found better hunting grounds elsewhere or had met their end at the hands of settlers protecting their livestock, Elijah never learned. Sometimes, on particularly still nights when the moon illuminated the clearing around his cabin, he would imagine he saw a flash of amber eyes at the forest edge, watching him with intelligent curiosity. But it was likely just memory and imagination playing tricks in the moonlight. Years passed and Elijah Thorne's reputation grew throughout the Colorado Territory. Contraption Thorne became a name spoken with respect rather than derision. Younger trappers and settlers sought him out for advice on coexisting with the predators, that still roamed the high country. Some of his simpler innovations became common features of remote cabins and camps, particularly his sonic deterrents that kept wolves at bay without resorting to poison or traps. By the time Colorado achieved statehood in 1876, Elijah was approaching 60 years of age, his beard now more white than brown, his movements slowed by the accumulated injuries and hardships of a life spent in the wilderness. Yet his mind remained sharp, constantly developing new contraptions to address the challenges of mountain living. In the summer of 1878, William Palmer, now a successful railroad developer, returned to Elijah's Valley with an unusual proposal. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was pushing west through the mountains, bringing unprecedented numbers of settlers and tourists into regions once known only to trappers and prospectors. The company is establishing a natural history museum in Colorado Springs, Palmer explained, sitting by Elijah's fire just as he had years before. We want to showcase the wildlife of the region, educate people about conservation rather than merely exploitation. Your wolf deterrent systems would make an excellent exhibit, demonstrating how humans can coexist with predators rather than exterminate them. The idea appealed to Elijah more than he had expected. As he had grown older, he had watched with increasing concern as the wilderness retreated before the advance of railroads, mining operations, and settlements. The wolves that had once been numerous throughout the mountains were now rarely seen, victims of organized hunting campaigns and habitat loss. "I'm too old to move to the city," he told Palmer, "but I could build working models of my contraptions for your museum, with detailed instructions for their construction and use." Palmer was delighted with this compromise. Over the following months, Elijah created smaller versions of his most effective devices, carefully documenting the principles behind each one and the specific situations for which they were designed. When the collection was complete, Palmer arranged for their transport to Colorado Springs, where they would form the centerpiece of a new exhibit on human-wildlife coexistence. Elijah never visited the museum himself, preferring the solitude of his mountain home to the bustle of even a small city, but reports reached him occasionally of how his contraptions were received by visitors. Children were particularly fascinated by the moving parts and the strange sounds they produced, while serious naturalists studied their design with professional interest. More importantly, several large ranching operations began experimenting with modified versions of his deterrent systems, seeking alternatives to the mass killing of predators that had characterized frontier development. The results were promising, suggesting that Elijah's methods might offer a middle path between unrestrained exploitation and the complete abandonment of human settlement. As Elijah entered his 7th decade, he gradually reduced his trapping activities, focusing instead on refining his contraptions and documenting his lifetime of observations about mountain ecology. Young forest rangers from the newly established Division of Forestry occasionally made the journey to his remote cabin, seeking his counsel on wildlife management and fire prevention. He received them with patience, sharing what knowledge he could, though he often found their scientific terminology foreign to his self-taught understanding of the natural world. Still, he recognized in these educated young men a respect for the wilderness that had been lacking in earlier generations of settlers, and this gave him hope for the future of his beloved mountains. In the autumn of 1885, as aspens once again turned golden on the surrounding slopes, Elijah felt the first serious warnings of his own mortality. A persistent cough settled in his chest, and activities that had once been routine now left him exhausted. When the first snows fell in October, he faced the approaching winter with uncharacteristic apprehension. On a clear November morning, as he checked his defensive perimeter more from habit than necessity, he paused at the edge of the clearing, looking out toward the forest, where Shadow and his pack had once tested the limits of human ingenuity. The trees stood silent in their coating of fresh snow, revealing no tracks or signs of the large predators that had once been common in these mountains. "They have gone before me," he murmured to himself, feeling a strange kinship with the wolves he had spent so much energy defending against. Both he and they were relics of an earlier time, when the wilderness still held mysteries beyond human understanding, when survival required respect for the natural world rather than domination of it. As he turned back toward his cabin, movement at the forest edge caught his eye. There, partially concealed behind a snow-dusted pine, stood a wolf. Not the massive Shadow or any member of that long-vanished pack, but a younger animal, lean and watchful. Its eyes, catching the morning sunlight, gleamed amber. Elijah froze, then slowly raised his hand in a gesture that was partly greeting, partly acknowledgement. The wolf watched him for several heartbeats, then turned and disappeared into the forest with fluid grace. Whether this was a descendant of Russet, the perceptive female who had seemed to understand his contraptions, or merely a solitary survivor of the systematic predator elimination programs that had swept through the territory, Elijah could not know. But the encounter left him with a sense of completion, of natural cycles continuing despite human interference. That winter proved to be Elijah Thorne's last in the mountains he had called home for more than 40 years. When trappers stopped by his cabin in the spring of 1886, they found him seated in his favorite chair by the cold hearth, a journal open on his lap, his expression peaceful. His contraptions still surrounded the clearing, some still functioning as the wind passed through them, creating their strange music in memory of the man who had given them voice. In accordance with wishes he had expressed to William Palmer years earlier, Elijah was buried on a small rise overlooking his valley, beneath a simple wooden marker that bore only his name and the words, "He learned the language of wolves." His journals and remaining contraptions were sent to the Colorado Springs Museum, where they joined the collection he had created years before. Together, they told the story of a man who had sought to understand the wilderness rather than conquer it, who had met its challenges with innovation rather than destruction. In the decades that followed, as conservation gradually replaced exploitation in the management of America's natural resources, Elijah Thorne's methods gained new appreciation among a generation of wildlife biologists seeking non-lethal ways to manage conflicts between humans and predators. His contraptions, once mocked as the creations of a solitary eccentric, became recognized as pioneering examples of behavioral deterrence, forerunners of techniques that would eventually help restore wolves to their ecological role in the Mountain West. By the early 20th century, the wolves had largely vanished from Colorado's mountains, victims of systematic extermination campaigns that valued livestock over predators. Elijah's Valley, once remote and wild, had become accessible by automobile, its pristine character gradually eroded by tourism and development. Yet, in certain remote corners of the high country, where human presence remained minimal, reports occasionally surfaced of wolves seen moving silently through moonlit forests. Some were undoubtedly coyotes mistaken for their larger cousins, but others, described by experienced outdoorsmen who knew the difference, suggested that perhaps a few descendants of Shadow's pack had survived in the most inaccessible regions, and in these same remote areas, a curious phenomenon sometimes occurred. Hunters or hikers camping alone would report strange sounds in the night, music that seemed to emerge from the wilderness itself, a harmony of wind through hollow wood and metal singing against metal. Those familiar with local history would smile knowingly at such tales, attributing them to lingering contraptions built by Contraption Thorne decades earlier, still standing guard over the mountains he had loved. Whether such devices truly survived the passage of years seems doubtful. More likely, the legend of Elijah Thorne had itself become part of the wind's voice, a story told by the wilderness to remind those who would listen that there are ways to live alongside nature's predators that require neither fear nor destruction, but rather understanding, respect, and the quiet ingenuity of a man who learned to speak the language of wolves. Sometimes in the deep forests where few people venture, when the wind moves through the pines and the moonlight casts strange shadows across snow-covered clearings, it is still possible to imagine that Elijah's contraptions continue their silent work, maintaining the balance between human innovation and wild instinct that was his lasting legacy to the mountains he called home.